me in 1986 in a primary school in central Scotland. I remembered that I was in the red group for reading, and much like many other children, you figure out very quickly where you rank within the ability groups in the classroom. And I realised that I wasn't in the top reading group, and I remember feeling quite negatively about that. I was, however, in the top maths group, and I felt sorry for the other children that weren't in that group. I remember thinking, why didn't they just get maths the way that I did? Ability grouping has been used for a long time by teachers to narrow the range of differentiation in the classroom. So teachers would usually work with a small group of students around tables or an area in the classroom, and they would work with each group one at a time. One thing to note here is that I'm not very comfortable as a teacher with the word ability, but for the purpose of this talk, what I'm referring to is a child's current ability in their learning, not about a notion of fixed ability or IQ, or about what children might be able to do in the future. As a teacher back in Scotland, I always used ability groups to teach the children in maths and in English, because I saw it as the most effective way to cover all of the needs in my classroom. I would always start at the beginning of the year with 3 reading groups, but by the end of the year, I felt as though I could have had 5 or 6 reading groups, and at some points, I felt as though I could have planned an individual lesson for every single child in that class, but that would have been ridiculous. Why did I always feel that way? And I think it's because, regardless of being placed in an ability group, children will always have their own personal, unique next steps in learning. In the world of education, there has been a long-standing debate around whether we should use ability groups to teach reading or whether we should use a whole class approach. Advocates of ability groups would tell you that children are catered for because they're working within a group where they can access the text. The learning is sort of targeted to their level. And advocates of whole class reading would tell you that even the children who are lower ability readers are brought on because they're having access to higher sort of expectations, more complex language within those texts. Teachers who are wary of whole class reading would worry about the children who perhaps can't access that text. How is that making them feel if they're not able to read the text that's being used in a whole class lesson? Teachers who are wary of ability groups would question, as a teacher, when you're working with that one group, what are the rest of your students doing? I know that when I used ability groups to teach reading, I would give those students other tasks like spelling, handwriting, and usually some follow-up reading activities. Things like creating a character study, maybe writing a blurb for the book, maybe creating the front cover, and lots of other activities. But if I'm really honest with myself, I don't know if all of those activities really develop the children as readers. My school is currently working towards high performance learning accreditation, and high performance learning is a philosophy developed by Deborah Eyre which sees all students as high performers regardless of their ability. All children, or most children, will get there in time, given the opportunities and support and over time. When I first arrived in Dubai in 2013, I remember going to observe a maths lesson. And at the beginning of the lesson, the teacher got all the students together and she taught maths to the whole class. And I remember thinking at the beginning of that lesson, where is the differentiation? How is this teacher going to cater for the needs of all of the different children in the classroom when she's teaching all of them together? And I realised very quickly that The teacher had created differentiated follow-up activities for the children, and she used the traffic light system to do that. So the green activities allowed children to have independent learning that was at an entry level, and the amber activities at a mid-level, and the red activities were the most challenging in the classroom. And I remember that I knew some of the children in that class, and some of the children that I knew to be the lower ability attainers actually really surprised myself and the teacher by starting off at entry-level challenges, but then progressing quite quickly onto more complex activities. Equally, some children that I knew to be high attaining learners felt that they needed a little bit more confidence, and they would start at entry-level challenges and very quickly progress onto more complex challenges. Over the last 5 years, we have used this approach particularly to teach maths in my school, and I've found it to be quite effective. Since we started this, the traffic lights have become chilly challenges, but the philosophy remains the same. All children have access to all learning, and then the differentiation comes in their independent follow-up activities. In my school, we use whole class reading approaches from year 3 onwards. In the foundation stage, or reception year in the UK, and key stage 1, we use a well-known synthetic systematic phonics programme. And for that phonics programme, which involves phonics practice, reading and writing, we do set the children, so we group them into ability groups. Until the pandemic. In Dubai, our children came back to school in September 2020 after global school closures. And the teachers had to learn very quickly how to innovate their practice. We had some students who were still online, so we had to work out how to include them in the lesson. And the children that we had in front of us in the classroom had to be socially distanced. They all had to sit at their own table, in some year groups wearing masks, but group seating was not allowed. And this meant that we had to unlearn and relearn how to group the children for reading. And it meant that we had to adopt a whole class reading approach, providing that support for children who perhaps couldn't access the text. And what we learned from that is that usually, every year when we group the children by ability, despite having regular assessments and all of those groups being fluid and children are able to move to the next group depending on their progress, the children in the lowest ability groups, while they do make progress, they largely remain as a group as they move through the year. But this year, during the pandemic, we actually found that we don't have children who are stuck in lower ability reading groups. More of our children, in Key Stage 1 in particular, are reading at a higher level. And the reason for this, we believe, is that all of our children have had access to stage-appropriate, age-appropriate reading materials, and there's been a higher expectation for all students. Self-efficacy is the belief that we have in ourselves to be able to do something. It's the belief that we have in our own success. And there are two things which are the sort of main factors in self-efficacy. The first one is about experiencing mastery. So if you're learning something brand new and you start to experience some success with that, it makes you believe that you can do it. It gives you that self-efficacy. The second most important factor in determining self-efficacy is observing others be successful. Again, if we think about learning new things, if we see our peers, people in our family, people around us being successful, it makes us believe that we can do that too. Self-efficacy is extremely important for children who are learning to read. Self-efficacy is very strongly linked to motivation. and we need our students to have motivation when it comes to learning to read. We can't determine what our children bring with them to the classroom. Each child with their own unique family, their own interests, their own culture, their beliefs, and each child will bring their own repertoire of language, vocabulary to the classroom. There is thought to be a 30 million word gap by the age of 3 years old between children who come from the lowest income families and children who come from more affluent families. And the reason for that is thought to be the language that they're exposed to, the vocabulary that they're exposed to, and more recently some research around the conversations that they've been exposed to, whether they've heard them or taken part in those conversations. After children have learned to decode text, or whether they've learned through a whole language or whole word approach, once they've actually learned how to read, their reading comprehension largely relies on their knowledge of language and their knowledge of the world. I'm sure that many of you can relate to this, but when I was at university, I remember going to the university library and picking out research papers to read for exams and tests and things. And some of those research papers, I felt as though I absolutely couldn't read them, because they were so laden with context-specific vocabulary, lots of words that just weren't in my repertoire that I wasn't used to hearing or using, and it made it really difficult for me to be able to read that text. And children experience this from a very young age. Really, we need to know a lot about language, and we also need a sort of extensive or wide knowledge about the world. If you think about two children in the same class, so maybe around the middle of the primary school, and you've got a lower ability reader who loves basketball, knows everything there is to know about basketball, they play it at the weekends, they watch it on the television. You've got another child in that class who's a high ability reader who knows nothing about basketball. If you give both of those children a text based around basketball, you might find that that lower ability reader, and probably will find, that they would have better comprehension of that text after reading. So really, knowledge helps children when they are learning to read, and that vocabulary and that knowledge of language will help them with their reading comprehension. Throughout a child's time in school, there are lots of sort of checkpoints where we have to assess the children and see how they're getting on with their learning. So if we think about end of Key Stage 1 requirements, end of Key Stage 2 requirements, possibly SATs at that stage, and then eventually checkpoints which actually count as qualifications and will determine where that child goes to university, what they'll study, what their job is going to be. So thinking about GCSE qualifications, A-level qualifications. Ability groups are great in theory, but if that's the only thing that you do in that subject, you're never going to close the gap for those children who are in lower ability groups. You're eventually going to run out of time. You don't have infinite time before children come to those qualifications like GCSE and A-level. You will eventually run out of time if ability groups is the only thing that you're doing. So what does all this mean for the teaching of reading? Over the last year, I have slowly come to the realization or the opinion that we need to be doing both when teaching children to read. We need to have children working in ability groups where they are getting to experience that success, they're in the safety net of that group, they've got texts which are accessible to them, and they can see themselves making that progress. And that's them experiencing success, they're getting that self-efficacy. But we also need whole class reading opportunities, particularly for those students who are not reading at an age or stage appropriate level. They have to hear the vocabulary that's expected at that age or stage level. They have to be able to take part in rich discussion, class discussions around the text, you know, thinking about inference, discussions around what happens if we say this in a different way, can you read it like this, what if we play with the punctuation here, what will happen, why did the author use this word? Lots and lots of discussion. And some of you in the room that are teachers or leaders in school will probably think, well, where are you going to find the time to do this? But I think we need to look carefully at the time that we spend for reading and the activities that we're giving children, perhaps as follow-ups. Do they need to have those activities? Is there ways of getting more discussion into the reading lesson, shared reading, guided reading, the teacher modelling that reading process? And this is something that I'm really looking forward to developing this year in my school. And we've managed to sort of carve out time in the timetable already to allow for that. The global pandemic has forced us to try lots of new things within teaching and learning so that our children could still experience success this year. If it wasn't for the pandemic, I don't think we would have taken such a gamble, particularly with our FS2 and our Key Stage 1 students. However, we have learned important lessons, and I hope that we can use those lessons to make learning better in the future.